So I'm Hannah Lester and I'm the Scientific Director at Penn & Tech. And today I'm going to be speaking to you about the regulatory landscape for alternative dairy products and dairy ingredients in the EU. So today I want to cover which regulations actually apply to the alt dairy industry and the regulatory landscape, and also to sort of highlight potential regulatory pitfalls and how to avoid them. So I wanted to start off by showing you this amazing map. So this is basically the alt dairy landscape, and it's a map that's been put together by Kind Earth Tech. And I think it really is a great visual representation of all the companies that are active in this space. And it really demonstrates that it's a very, very fast growing area. This map shows all of the different alt dairy types of food and food ingredients. So we have obviously the typical plant-based products, but we also have dairy products that are derived by fermentation, and also the cell-based dairy products as well. So I'm going to be talking about all of these three broad areas today. So I want to start off by sort of discussing which regulations apply. And actually, there's a huge list of regulations that do apply, but I just want to focus on some today and sort of the key sort of regulations that apply. So we have labeling, food hygiene, allergenicity, novel food and traditional food, and GMO. But what I want to really sort of focus on today and talk about today are the novel foods and traditional foods, and I'll also just briefly touch on the GMO side as well. Okay, so what is a novel food, and what's the difference between a novel food and a traditional food? So both novel foods and traditional foods are covered by EU Regulation 2015-2283, which is the EU Novel Food Regulation. But the definition of a novel food is a food, ingredient, or manufacturing process that has not been consumed or used in the EU prior to 15th of May 1997. Whereas on the other hand, a traditional food is a food that has not been consumed within the EU prior to 1997, but has been consumed to a significant extent outside of the EU in a third country. But it's very important to note that traditional foods only apply to whole foods that have been minimally processed. So these are things like seaweeds, algae, nuts, seeds, things like that. So the traditional food route is not applicable to all types of products and ingredients. It's also very important to note what's not a novel food. So food enzymes, additives, flavoring solvents, and GMO do not fall within the scope of the novel food regulation and are actually covered by their own regulations. So how do you check if your alternative dairy product is indeed novel or not? So the first thing to note is it's the responsibility of the food business operator, or FBO, to check assess the novel status of their product. And the food business operator is the person or company that's legally responsible for placing that food or ingredient on the market. So the kind of questions to sort of ask yourself are, has your product been consumed in the EU prior to 1997? Does it have a history of safe consumption? Has your product been consumed to any significant degree outside of the EU? And something that's really, really important is the manufacturing process itself new or novel? There are two resources that you can easily check to help you when you're trying to find out if your product is novel or not. So the first is you can check the Union list of novel foods. So this is the official legal list of all of the authorized novel foods in the EU and their specification. So this is the official list that you can refer to. Secondly, there's the online novel food catalogue, which is not a legally binding resource. It's just literally a catalogue of the legal status of different ingredients based on the opinions of different EU member states. So it's not legally binding, but it's a good reference to check nonetheless. This is just a very simple table. I just wanted to sort of demonstrate what's not novel, what's borderline, and what would be considered novel in terms of plant-based milk or drink. So obviously, things like coconut, soy, hemp, rice, these have been consumed to a significant extent within the EU prior to 1997. So there's no question that these products are not novel. In terms of borderline products, I thought this was really interesting, and I actually picked this off the Kind Earth Tech map. So it would be algae or species of algae used for plant-based milk or drinks. And this is borderline because it would really depend on which algae species are being used and also the manufacturing process. So if you were using algae, you'd need to look into this a bit more. Then on the novel or traditional food side, I mean, these would certainly fit within the traditional food category because they're minimally processed, would be ingredients such as the pili nut, quinoa, bambara. And all of these would require novel food authorization before being able to be used in food in the EU. I just wanted to show you some examples from the Novel Food Catalogue. So the Novel Food Catalogue is not the legally binding resource, but it's still a good place to start. And this is an example using quinoa, and it gives you a description of the quinoa, and it says basically that you can use the grains and fruits from quinoa as food and food ingredients in the EU. And this green tick here means that it's fine, it's not novel. Interestingly, I found something called quinoa, which is the same genus as quinoa, but it's a different species. And this, in this instance, it would be classified as a novel food and would require authorization before being sold in the EU, because there's no significant history of its consumption prior to 1997. And then this is another sort of interesting case as well. So this is called Bambara groundnut, so that's the common name, which is related to the mung bean. And in this particular case, we have this wonderful orange box with a question mark. And this means that the EU member states have not decided whether this is novel or not. So they're pending further information to make their classification. So I just wanted to highlight the sort of three different scenarios. So quinoa would be fine, quinoa would not be fine, and this Bambara groundnut is sort of a grey area at the moment. So what do you have to do if you want to register a traditional food? So the traditional food registration process is based on a history or demonstrating the history of consumption in a third country. And you need to demonstrate continuous consumption for a minimum period of 25 years, and demonstrate that it's a significant part of a customary diet in a third country. So there's a lot of literature reviews that go on and building all of this evidence. And then you build your dossier and you submit the notification to the European Commission. The European Commission then sends the notification to the EU member states and EFSA. And if there's no safety concerns raised by any of the member states, then the product will be authorized or the ingredient will be authorized. If there are any safety concerns, then EFSA is asked, or the European Food Safety Authority is asked to perform a thorough safety assessment. And after all of this has happened, the European Commission then grants the authorization. So all being well, and if there are no safety concerns, you can get the product authorised within 4 months. But this could be longer if there are any safety concerns, and you'd be looking at a timeline of around 1.5 years. So I then wanted to just discuss the other sort of alt dairy product areas. So first I'd like to sort of discuss the dairy proteins that are derived by fermentation. And I wanted to use casein as an example. So, you go through the whole step of asking these questions. So has casein been consumed in the EU prior to 1997? This is obviously yes. Does the product have a safe history of use? The answer is obviously yes. And has it been consumed outside of the EU? Yes. However, here in this case, the key difference is the manufacturing process. So the manufacturing process in this instance is new and novel. So therefore, this particular case would trigger a novel food authorization. Then we've got the cell-based dairy. I'm sure you've all seen on the news today that Just have got their cell-based chicken approved in Singapore. So that's very, very exciting. But on the cell-based dairy front, again, if you go through the whole process of, asking yourself all of these questions, then there's no doubt that dairy has been consumed and has a very long history of safe use. But again, it's the manufacturing process that is new and novel, and therefore would trigger a novel food authorization. So what do you have to do if your product is novel? So you have to gather data on the safety of your product and submit a dossier to the European Commission. This dossier is evaluated by EFSA, and they perform a rigorous safety assessment. And after that, they publish their opinion. And it's then up to the European Commission to grant authorization based on the scientific opinion of EFSA. So all being well, the whole EFSA part, so the scientific evaluation, should take 9 months, but a realistic timeline from dossier submission to getting your authorization is 1.5 to 3 years based on our experience. So I then briefly wanted to discuss the potential regulatory pitfalls for each of the different plant-based product areas. And I think the key sort of regulatory pitfall for plant-based dairy products, or whether or not the ingredients are novel or not. And that requires a sort of a thorough assessment. And you also need to consider how the product is being manufactured. Obviously, with all protein-based products, then allergenicity is very important and needs to be considered. But I'm not going to go into that in much detail today. And for the plant-based products, it's really important to remember about the traditional food route, because this requires, well, it's basically your cheap and quick route to market. So it's something certainly to look into if you have the right type of product and the right type of data or evidence to back that up. And then obviously labeling is critical and very, very, very important. What do we call these products? I mean, I could have spoken for 20 minutes or even longer on this subject alone. So I'm not going to go into detail here, but it's just something to be very aware of, which I'm sure you already are. In terms of dairy ingredients that are produced by fermentation, it's important to note that the whole product and the whole manufacturing process needs to be evaluated and needs to be safe. So it's not only the final product that's evaluated, but it's also the production microorganism that will require a safety assessment as well. So for the microorganism, you need to produce and provide the whole genome sequence data. You need to demonstrate the absence of toxins and virulence factors, antibiotic production, antimicrobial resistance. And it's also important to highlight that you can use genetically modified production microorganisms, and that will be absolutely fine and raise no regulatory red flags if you can demonstrate an absence of the GM DNA in the final product. If not, then you run into GM nightmares. So it's just important to highlight that point. And then on the cell-based front, I think the most critical issue is your cell line. And you really need to evaluate your cell line and what you're doing to it, and whether or not the way that you're inducing the cells actually then strays into the territory of GM. So that is really, I would say, the critical issue. Also to highlight that everything involved in the manufacturing process is evaluated as part of the safety assessment. So the growth serum needs to be safe. So you need to use safe ingredients in your growth serum. And also scaffolding, you need to consider the scaffolding used in the product as well. So whether that's a processing aid or whether it forms part of the novel food itself, you have to consider the scaffolding. Again, allergenicity is very important, and I would say critically to the cell-based products is the labeling and what are we going to call these things. So the key take-home messages from me today, I mean, there's no doubt about it, the EU has a very, very tough regulatory framework, and it's only getting more complicated. So it's always a very good starting point to check the legal status of your product, and always consider the regulatory strategy from the very beginning of product development, because this will save a lot of time and heartache later down the line. So thank you all very much for listening. Please feel free to contact me by this email address. I'll be hanging around for the rest of the conference, so please feel free to come and visit me in the digital booth. I'm not sure what that means, but it sounds exciting. So please do feel free to come and say hello, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that you may have.